It's a Monday, a time when we usually do reviews on books, documentaries, and so on and so forth. And this morning I have probably what is one of the, I suppose, most explosive bits of content in the form of a book that I've had in the longest time. The book is titled Lives on the Line. It's authored by David Africa. David Africa spent a very brief period in the intelligence services here in South Africa, and in particularly Cape Town. Um, he the book is largely based on the life of Pagot, the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, and his role as part of a task team to essentially try and understand what Pagot was and to break it down, because to them it was seen as, a sort of a terrorist like organization, much like how the United States and others once described it as. But before I get to the bits of Paget and details that the book so entails, I want to start off with David Africa, who's of course my guest here, the author of the book. Former intelligence officer. He writes that he, of course, in the 1980s or so, much of that decade, he spent his life on the run from the security branch, the infamous security branch. He talks about the late 80s, where he then, regularly, saw himself in a tussle with that security branch. And about the mid 1980s is when, at the age of 14, he became active in high school student politics. He was an active figure in student politics through the late 1980s. He was recruited to join the ANC's underground by the late 1980s, about 1988 or so, and he then undertook 2 years of military training in Uganda before having returned to South Africa after the first democratic election and the ANC-led government of national unity at around 1994. He talks about how his journey of activism ultimately led him to the fifth floor conference room at the notorious Old Branch Operational Center. This is in Loop Street in central Cape Town, where he met those whom had hunted him and others, arrested, tortured, and sent some of him and his comrades to prison. Some of those around as he describes it, the mahogany conference table, were responsible for the deaths of dear comrades who did not quite live to see the fruits of the sacrifice in the form of a democratic South Africa. He goes on to, of course, describe how initially there was some chatter about him and others joining the military under this new dispensation, but that wasn't quite palatable to him. He didn't quite see himself in that sort of role. And then later, at the insistence of a dear ANC comrade, that he was convinced to join the intelligence community, where he was part of an integrating team, that was going to be involved in crime intelligence. He says that he ended up working in separate intelligence organizations, and certainly the decision to join the intelligence community was part of his political alignment and many fellow other ANC intelligence operatives. And then goes on to state how perhaps this was the going after Pagot was probably one of the most key focus areas of his life, post the democratic South Africa. David Africa, good morning, welcome to Radio 786, and thank you very much for your time.
The listeners.
Thank you very much for being with us. We got the tail end of that. Let's just be clear, you can hear me, correct?
I can hear you clearly.
We can hear you now clearly as well. Thank you very much, certainly, for your time. Before I get into, I suppose, the nugget of our discussion here this morning, which of course has a lot to do with the investigation into the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, PAGAD. Around that time when you joined the intelligence services, what was the mandate? What was the goal? Because it was right at the onset of a democratic dispensation, and of course now having to work alongside those, as you say, that hunted you. It was now beginning to build a new state, and so when you walked into this new role, what was your thinking?
Right. So the first, really, the primary point that drove myself and others who joined with me was political, in the sense that we obviously had a democratic election in April 94. We now had a democratic government elected by an overwhelming majority of people. But just having been elected was not sufficient to in the first instance, secure that government. Remember that at the time and the period preceding the election, there was a lot of talk about third force activity, coups being planned by elements of the security establishment and so on. So it was important politically that people from the liberation movement, and I mean, there were ANC people and people from the Azanian People's Liberation Army who integrated largely into the military, of course. And then some of us into the various arms of the intelligence community. So to me, it was very political in that sense that one wanted to, be part of securing the new state, um, but also to build, in my case, intelligence institutions um, that had to work in a new context. I mean, driven by obviously a democratic government, a new constitutional dispensation, a dispensation that was underpinned by human rights and so on. So those were really what, as we were preparing for and then entering the intelligence services, those were the things that really drove us to take that decision and to do it.
And the names I suppose that's familiar with some listeners of Radio 786 would be the likes of Peter Jacobs, Jeremy Vieri stands out there as well. Anwar Dramat is another one. I know Anwar was at some stage part of the Bonteheuwel military wing as well, and grown up in Bonteheuwel, and later, of course, went on to become an intelligence officer, and then at some stage headed the Hawks, a specialized policing unit in South Africa. And of course, we are all familiar, certainly, with his eventual end to his role in the policing at that time. And so that's the sort of band of people that you had been with at the time. And and when you then joined, this new apparatus, state apparatus, as it were, um, was the decision to quickly jump forward, because we don't, of course, have a lot of time, but was the decision taken to say that this will be your almost immediate task? Because Pagot then comes onto the scene in the early 90s and the mid 90s, and you talk about how Pagot, as you saw it together, I suppose, with Qibla as well, you saw it as an organization that was taking issue fundamentally with the way in which the transition happened in South Africa's constitutional democratic society. Am I describing that correctly? That is the sort of foundation under which Pagot was understood at the time.
Well, the understanding obviously does not arise immediately, in the sense that when one first encounters Pagot, and obviously Qibla, those of us who were involved in the liberation movement, we know Qibla from the 80s because we were, in a sense, together in the trenches against the apartheid regime. We know Qibla comrades, we know Qibla comrades who were part of the PAC and UPLA and so on. So we but now there's a new phenomenon, this thing called Pagot, right? Now, one doesn't immediately make a characterization in the first instance because you don't have, from day one all the information to make a characterization. And one doesn't just jump to conclusions. In the second instance, one wants to see how the thing evolves because there could be a relationship between two organizations, let's say in this instance, Qibla and Pagot, but the exact nature of that relationship might not be clear for some time. So it wasn't a case of, since there is a Qibla and now there is a Pagot, and there are Qibla people active in Pagot, that this thing is related in the way in which we later characterized it. So, sorry, the characterization comes with time when one is confident enough to make that characterization. And I must tell you that we were very reluctant to make these characterizations in haste. Um, you were talking, for example, earlier even about characterizing it as terrorism. That is to say, characterizing Paget's activity as terrorist. Um, Even that characterization came with time and came with a lot of engagement. And when we felt that now we have, one, sufficient information, and two, we have sufficiently analyzed this thing in order to characterize it as such. So there was no rush to say, you know, this is what it is. You will recall that in the first year or two of Paget's existence, there were lots of initiatives to reach out. I mean, both from the government, the police, through, for example, the Center for Conflict Resolution, to try and find ways in which Paget could be accommodated. Other efforts by civil society, some religious leaders, for example, also the Western Cape Anti-Crime Forum, to see how this movement, which has now emerged, could be brought into the fight against crime alongside other institutions. So it's not as if from day one there was, there are these Paget people, and since there are some Qibla people with them, this is how we characterize them. That definitely was not the case.
Yeah, but in the book, you describe Paget. Perhaps maybe this is when writing the book, you collecting some of these thoughts. But you root Paget's emergence onto the South African political scene as one that had taken issue with the election of Nelson Mandela, South Africa's founding president of a black democratic order. Talking about how paradoxically Paget was partially an expression of a political rebellion against a negotiated settlement that brought Mandela and the ANC to power. Because I mean, my very superficial reading of just the name of the organization says it is against drugs and gangsterism. You seem to suggest that its foundation was political against a democratic order.
What I'm suggesting in the book is that PAGAD was, we'll get to the name now, but PAGAD was an initiative by Qibla people, which was a political initiative. Qibla's position at the time, and obviously Qibla was not unique in this, was that the negotiated political settlement and the transition that emerged from it was not a legitimate dispensation. There were many other people who held this view. So in that sense, it was a view to be held by whoever wanted to hold it. And there's nothing that compels people to say, I agree with this negotiated settlement. So the fact that there were people who held a view that said this transition is an illegitimate transition it is a legitimate political view to be held. Now, when I say that Paget's emergence, because Paget emerges out of, let's say, thinking by Qibla people, it doesn't emerge as a purely anti-gangsterism, anti-drug initiative. I mean, that would demand a lot of naivety of anyone who read even the very initial speeches that was held, that were delivered by Paget people. For example, the demands placed on government in February 1996, sorry, intensely political, just after Paget is established. The march to Dalla Umar's house. I mean, this had a very clear political character. There was no such a thing as an organization called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs that was purely targeting gangsterism and drugs. So I'm saying that to imagine it was non-political is naive. I'm also saying that to have held that political position at the time, that the negotiated transition is not legitimate, was also a credible and a legitimate political position to hold.
Oh, okay. And against that backdrop, of course, I want to move to that infamous event in Salt River, in which, we saw Staki having been shot and killed. And right to the onset, of course, you talk about that operation and how you were on the scene at the time. And you say it is quite clear that one of the 4 or 5 members that were in the vicinity of Staki when he came out to meet the group, that they had been responsible for his killing in a very brazen way. And of course, I see Radio 786 features here in the book, in which, of course, you talk about how the PAGAD supporting Radio 786 had started broadcasting continuous updates on that evening's developments and calling on the Muslim community to gather at the mosque. This, of course, is Masjid al-Quds in Gatesville, claiming that it was under imminent threat of an attack. You go on there, of course, to highlight how there were efforts to try and engage the leadership of PAGAD, and particularly that crucial moment of the killing of Staki, and in the later meeting at the mosque, etc. And then, of course, we saw the emergence of the G-Force grouping and so on. What was the sort of thinking at the time? Because, of course, you highlight how this was a very explosive situation, that we saw, further action that could be triggered. Was that the stage at which point the security apparatus took a lot more note of PAGAD, more than just what you had already done, as you described, that there was only really a handful of you guys, in the crowd at the time in Salt River when this decision was taken, of course, to unalive Staki. What was the political and the security assessment post that event? What was the thinking within the security apparatuses?
Okay, so the bureaucracy works. It grinds slowly. So you have intelligence which you start developing before things explode, as it did with the killing of Staki. Even before that, there were some pipe bomb attacks, petrol bomb attacks, and so on. But obviously nothing as explosive as that evening. All of us who are from the Cape Flats, we know how significant that event was. So one writes reports to say that, look, this is an emerging threat. In the first instance, you write reports to say there's something emerging which one has to monitor because you are not sure where it will go. Then you start saying that people are talking about conducting acts of violence. Petrol bomb, pipe bomb, these things didn't happen. Then you have this situation. Now, the way the system worked, or let's say didn't work at the time, was that there was a sort of euphoria about the transition, and people thought that everything will be fine and everyone buys into the new political system and so on. Obviously, there are undercurrents there, frustrations in communities and so on. There are political machinations taking place. And so then this thing happens and it explodes. When it happens, that is to say the day after Staki is killed, obviously it hits the media in a big way, and then the politicians start paying attention and they say, but what is happening there? And this is when there is now at the highest levels of government a very direct concern that this thing is bigger than we initially thought, right? And this is where this concern translates into a lot of poor decision making on the part of government. For example, the idea that you can now just deploy a lot of police to the province and this will somehow solve the problem. The idea that you can establish, a task team under old apartheid cops and somehow they will be able to fix it. obviously all of these things fail, over time. But that event is really the one that make people take notice. I mean, not just the public and the media, but also the decision makers in government. It really focused people's attention that there is something happening here, which is larger than we imagined it to be.
And at that point, and post that, very tense meeting that you had to walk into at the mosque to meet with the then Pagot leadership,
Mm,
to try and calm situations, because, as you say, to Paget, this was seen as a victory, and then there was, very many shifting, I suppose, battles around narratives as well. That part of that contingent, that joined you and others, in the aftermath of that killing of Staki, were even former security branch members, Afrikaners, for instance. You talk about, Afrikaners to the core. Um, how did that influence, or did it in any way influence, um, the understanding of Pagan and what it represented? Because I suppose naturally there was a contestation between these balaclava clad, largely men that are armed to the teeth and very ideologically driven, etc. But also at the same time, some of your colleagues were the very people that tried to oppress those other persons in a life that
mm,
is not too far distant away. So how do we
mm.
know that those intentions to, for instance, penetrate and go after Pagan were fundamentally rooted within law and not some previously held, you know,
Mm.
nuances, let's call it, around, their political orientation?
Um, it wasn't, and I'll tell you why. There are two big factors here. The first thing is that most of the intelligence work and the analytic work, which is where the characterization of a threat comes in, was done by ANC people, people like myself and Jeremy Vieri, for example. We did not have this baggage that these security branch people brought. In fact, the initial characterization of PAGAD amongst old cops, and I don't just mean the security branch people, I also mean the detective units, people like Leonard Knipe and others, who were very influential people in the police, you would recall from then. And this also reflected itself very much in the provincial government in the Western Cape at the time, which, as you will recall, was a National Party government, provincial government. Their interpretation for the first 2 years, I would say, of Paget's existence was that this is an ANC plot to destabilize the Western Cape because the ANC had lost the first democratic election in 1994 in the province. It was a very widely held view amongst them. Um, and obviously there was no credibility to it, but they somehow, maybe because they were used to sort of third force activities, they thought that we were also into that way of doing things, but that was their characterization. Um, the fact that there were Afrikaners and non-Afrikaner old security branch officers who now joined the team in which I worked was, I mean, they were not at the level where they were making these analytic judgments. They were collecting information, and we were also collecting information because remember, coming from those communities, we had very extensive networks.
Sure.
Yeah, we ANC people.
David, if I may permit, sorry, I just want to interject. On that point about they were not making analytical judgment, is that not true to the point that I'm trying to understand here? That for some of these guys, they were not analytical about the objectives of their work. For them, if this was an organization, expressing themselves in what was then understood to be in a very terrorist-like fashion, that the police needed to clamp down because they are in conflict with the law, for instance, and there could be a much bigger threat, etc. It wasn't analytically necessarily that was the orientation. It could have been, I suppose a lot more than that. And that's what I'm trying to understand, whether this unit that were a part of, whether the focus on implementing the law was the sole focus, aside for whether perhaps old scores needed to be settled.
No, I must disagree with you. Um, Look, let's look at the development of the intelligence capability that was focused on PAGAD. It starts with one person, which is myself. Now, whatever you think of me, I clearly don't come from that kind of background, right? I am then joined shortly before the Staki incident by one former security branch officer who is my junior in rank. Um, his view on what is happening here is not of his view to the extent that we are talking about it, because obviously we are colleagues, we are now discussing what is happening here. I mean, what does this mean, and so on and so on. Is not of the type that you are describing. Now, it takes about a year or more before other people join the team. I mean, the key people who join are people like Anwar Daramat, Mzwandile Petros, who became the provincial commissioner in Western Cape and subsequently in Gauteng. Jeremy is working very from early on the PAGAD situation in a different unit, but working on the same. And in fact, Jeremy is heading the team that's doing most of the interdepartmental analytic work on this thing. So I want to say that the judgments we came to, by we, I mean the institution now, were not driven by some sort of score settling from the old days or by some sort of Islamophobia or any such thing. Obviously, there were people in the new crime intelligence, those who came from the security branch, who had prejudices. I mean, many of these people were racist. We know them because we were targets of theirs in the 1980s and up to 1994. Many of them obviously individually were Islamophobic, which went with their racism. I am saying in the context specifically here to PAGAD, that influence was very minimal because of the way in which the capability targeting PAGAD evolved. It evolved around ANC people.
Okay. I want to come back to, of course, as we were talking earlier about what was PAGAD's stated goal, and that was the eradication of gangsterism and drugs. But of course, the book naturally, let's say through the first quarter or so of the book, it gets into whether this is more than just PAGAD, as you highlighted. And by the way, we're talking to David Africa. He's the author of the book called Lives on the Line. He's a former intelligence officer post the democratic era for a very short period of time, in which a lot of his work focused on investigating PAGAD and, by extension, the bit that I'm going to be reading right now. And I want to read a snippet of the book very quickly. I'll try and speed read, so please, listeners, keep up with me very quickly, right? David, you're right that despite Qibla's repeated energetic efforts, its initiatives to establish a popular front organizations have been met with limited success and short-lived victories. The group had faced significant challenges, particularly in gaining popularity among South Africans, predominantly Sunni Muslims, due to its hostility towards the recognized Muslim clergy and Qibla's perceived association with Iran. Traditionally, when Qibla established front organizations, it did not maintain a sufficient distance from these organizations so that they could operate, or at least a semblance of independence. Being confronted with PAGAD, the first Qibla initiative to gain widespread popular support amongst Muslims and non-Muslims alike, was a misfortune. According to Paget's constitution, its main declared objective was to serve as a broad front against gangs and drugs and to act as a pressure group to force the government and its agencies to deal with the problems of drugs and gangsters. And despite the predominantly Muslim character, Qibla initially brought together a broad spectrum of organizations and individuals with diverse political persuasions. Of course, you go on to write later. I'm just trying to find the snippet. Okay, I actually have to go a little bit back. I think it's at this point that talking, of course, here about how rooting in the nexus of where Qibla sort of found itself and particularly under what was then certainly the role of the Islamic Unity Convention as well, the IUC. And talking about Imam Ahmad Qasim, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but it's sort of all got to do with the same point that I want to raise now. Talking about the IUC group led by non-sectarian campaign welcoming all of Cape Town citizens opposed to the scourge of gangsterism and drugs. March 1994, shortly before the country's first democratic elections, the IUC claimed to represent nearly 300 constituent organizations from across South Africa. Talking about its inaugural conference of the IUC, where Imam Ahmad Qasim was elected as the leader, a former member of the PAC. Also, Qasim became the leader of Qibla, which you describe as a fringe Islamist militant movement inspired by, established after 1979, the Iranian Islamic Revolution. Qibla never really developed a mass following amongst South African Muslims. It was a small, closely knit organization. You say that your investigation, this was the intelligence community's investigation, required direct access to Qibla and the IUC to comprehensively understand their respective platforms. And this access was crucial to transforming our initial hunch into actionable intelligence. Does that mean that you guys did actually infiltrate PAGAD, Qibla, the Islamic Unity Convention?
Yes, we did. I mean, if you read the book, it's clear that we did. Look, we are trying to make sense of a number of things popping up, right? And we are trying to see in the first instance what these things are on their own. What is PAGAD? So what does PAGAD say it is? Is what it says it is what it is? What is its relationship to the IUC, to Qibla, and so on? So obviously there are individuals who are members of all these formations, but it doesn't mean necessarily that there is an institutional relationship. So one is trying to figure out how are these institutions related? Are they related beyond the fact that individuals are members of all of these? Remember, I come out of a political tradition where I was, for example, active in student politics in a national youth organization, the South African Youth Congress, in a civic organization in Manenberg, in the United Democratic Front, and in the ANC underground. So this is not the modus operandi I describe in the book, which is used by Qibla, is not, again, unique to Qibla. I mean, when organizations are trying to influence societies or parts of societies, they use these kinds of methods to expand their influence. So in order to find out what is happening, who are these people and institutions, and how do they relate? One obviously cannot go and read the newspaper to establish these kinds of facts. One has to, in the first instance, speak to people who have some familiarity, which are not, by that I don't mean infiltration. Obviously, Qibla is an organization that's been in existence for long. So many of us from Cape Town, we know Qibla and we know Qibla people. So you speak to people and you say, listen, what is happening here? I mean, how does this thing relate and so on? One gets information, what starts developing hypotheses, what could possibly be the relationships and so on. The only way in which you can really more or less definitively, because intelligence is not a scientific craft in the sense that you can be 100% sure of anything. The only way in which you can develop a greater measure of certainty is, or a greater measure of confidence in your judgments, is by infiltrating these organizations. Because you are concerned that there is a security dynamic developing here, which is going to cause problems for the new state. And as an intelligence community, your responsibility obviously is to make sure that that doesn't happen, or to mitigate where it does. So the way in which you do this, I mean, all over the world, is to infiltrate these organizations. And I mean, this is what intelligence people do. You know,
And what does that mean when you say infiltrate?
I mean, you recruit people who are members of these organizations, people who are active in these organizations.
To
You recruit
subvert,
them.
distract?
Excuse me.
Is that to extract information or to
It, it
redirect the
is to collect.
organization, to put it
It is
mildly?
to collect. It is to collect information. I mean, you are collecting information so that you can, make judgments, analytic judgments, security judgments to say this is what's happening, that is not happening, and so on. We didn't infiltrate any of these organizations in order to influence them. Obviously, when you recruit people, some people become amenable to a recruitment because they have, for example, a problem with the way in which the organization is moving. And I mean, this is a general rule. They were obviously, as we all know, in PAGAD, especially around and after the killing of Staki, there were many fissures that became public, which had existed before, because not everyone was into the whole thing of using violence and so on. Some people thought, let's build this packet, let's put pressure on the government, like a social movement. Let's work with other organizations involved in anti-crime initiatives and so on. So there were, now you recruit someone who is amenable to a recruitment because he or she does not agree with the direction the organization is taking. Now, you are not directing them to do anything, but they are there. I mean, they hold these views, which makes them more amenable to a recruitment. And they are trying to influence the organization. I mean, very prominent leaders of PAGAD, and these spats were public at some point. Ali Parker, Farouk Jaffer, Nadmi Idris, and others. Over time, other people also, broke away from PAGAD and so on. So we did not recruit people, I'll speak for myself here, in order to direct PAGAD or to direct Qibla. I mean, I think we would have been foolish to think that we would have been able to do that, because these organizations were very closely managed organizations. No one is going to infiltrate Qibla and direct it in opposition to Imam Qasim, for example. I mean, it would be foolish for me to think I'm going to take control of Qibla, because I knew Qibla people and I knew how Qibla was run and how it was directed. Our infiltration into these organizations was to establish intelligence on their intent, their capabilities, and their plans, and so on.
Okay. You understand, of course, David, that there is generally some mistrust of spooks and people that operate in the shadows, and what their stated intentions are. Hence, trying to understand exactly what the purpose of the infiltration of PAGAD, Qibla, IUC, and that entire grouping had been. I want to move on because we're running terribly tight with time, and there's so many things that I wanted to cover in the book. It's quite an explosive one. We're talking to David Africa. He's written the book Lives on the Line, dealing with largely PAGAD, but also complementary organizations like Qibla and the Islamic Unity Convention. David, of course, a former intelligence officer with the police and so on, and also talking there about and I'm going to dealing now with what you describe, David, as the shifting patterns in the sort of late 90s for PAGAD and what was then called the G Force, yeah, right? Saying that uh, And you're right, seizing control of the PAGAD infrastructure gave the Qibla Corps an expanded base to recruit members into the G Force. By the 1997, they had established active groups across the Cape Flats, identifying 21 G Force cells by the time I returned from the city to the city from Pretoria. You speak about the rapid growth of the G Force, creating publicity, and highlighting how certainly there was attempts to target more than just drug houses and gangsters and so on. You talk about Jenica and others that led some of these organizations, and going on to say that there were these active cells that were operating in largely Manenberg, Grassy Park, Mitchells Plain, Athlone, etc. You go on to highlight, the one of the bombings that had taken place, saying that when some of those members were found at the Gatesville Medical Center, it was then known as, of course, as the Gatesville Medical Center, in which the unit, of course, discovered that there were members being treated there that were involved, for instance, in the 30th of July explosion, going on then to later arrest them. The point of what you're raising here, because you talk about how people like Francis and Saleh were duly arrested, after the release in bail. You cite, for instance, people like Yusuf Williams, who later was known as Putayu. They became the primary conduits of the council's orders to the G4 cells, saying that it was clear from the reporting that they had commanded authority and respect amongst the G-Force. What was your understanding about the role of the G-Force? And you're saying, according to the research and the intelligence gathered then, that they have expanded their scope to what exactly and for what purpose?
So when the G-Force was established, its function was primarily defensive because you had obviously you had meetings at various mosques which needed to be protected. Obviously, there was the risk always that gangsters would attack and so on. So it was similar to what we had in the ANC and the liberation movement before '94. Marshals, people are protecting an event and so on, a march or a meeting and so on. But from the word go, there was a small group of people which did not call themselves G-Force. The G-Force was let's say, the defensive element of PAGAD in the early stages. And I'm talking about pre-Staki, so pre-August 1996. But there were a few, 2 or 3 small cells that were carrying out attacks already before Staki's murder. But there was a separation between these, let's call them offensive capabilities, and the G-Force, which had a primarily defensive responsibility. Ali Parker at the time, as the head of security, was mostly responsible for this, the G-Force, as you can call it. Now, with the removal of Parker and others, Nadmi Idris and others, one saw a very rapid merging of these defensive and offensive capabilities into the G-Force. And so, and this is when a sort of cell structure was established, obviously because there were now more people involved in launching attacks, offensive work. They had to be protected because the 2 or 3 small units that were doing it before were working in secrecy. The G-Force was a sort of broad open thing, people were getting together, securing marches and so on. But because some of them were now executing offensive tasks, carrying out attacks, they were organized into cells, typically, but not exclusively, cells in an area. So, guys who lived in Grassy Park in a cell, or in Manenberg or Delft and so on. But there was a lot of movement in between cells. And there were also some cells that had, in a sense, specific responsibilities, which were not geographic responsibilities. So in other words, they weren't confined to a particular area like Manenberg or Delft and so on. So you had a huge leap in offensive capability from a few, 2 or 3 small cells to a G-force that now had, I mean, we had identified 21, but there were more. I mean, it's not like we knew everything. Obviously, also over time, you see there's a new cell emerging, another one has gone dormant, and so on. You have a huge expansion in numbers of people involved in attacks. You also have a development in the type of weapons being used, because you will remember that the first attacks were carried out using guns, meaning pistols and so on, and petrol bombs, and then pipe bombs. The most rudimentary pipe bomb being a pipe bomb that was had a striker, like a firecracker that was set alight, and then the thing would be thrown and it would explode. It developed in sophistication, obviously, to the point in the end where these bombs were detonated remotely through a mobile phone. And also some bombs with timers, obviously, that was set, washing machine timers and then that sort of thing. So you would set the timer, place the bomb, and then it would go off in 15, 20, whatever minutes. So quantitative leap in numbers, qualitative leap in the sophistication of the weapons being deployed. You have a situation where there are a number of raids on police stations where police armories are emptied. So you have now assault rifles in the hands of these people. Together with that, there is a progression of the targeting of the G-force, which initially was very strictly confined to gangsters, gang leaders, and drug dealers. Pot and whoever else, there's a bomb thrown into their house or a petrol bomb or whatever. Jackie Lonti, Staki, and others. But then you start seeing an escalation in the sense that you now have state facilities. I mean, the offices of the PAGAD task team is bombed. Benny Lategan, who was an investigator on the PAGAD task team, is assassinated. There's an attempted assassination on Skalk Versaghi, who led that task team. There is a decision and an attempt to kill myself and Anwar Dramat. So you have this escalation. You have some attacks, for example, on synagogues. You have a magistrate being killed and so on. So quantitatively, qualitatively in terms of the kind of weaponry, and also strategically in terms of who is now being attacked. That shifts. There's also a shift in the initial attacks were very targeted. For example, there's the assassination of Jackie Lonti. Jackie Lonti is killed. Later on, you find that a gangster or a drug dealer is killed along with his family, wife and children. So it becomes less and less discriminate. So that was the trajectory between 1996, late 1996, and 2000, which became obviously increasingly worrying to us and to the government.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the book then in the preceding bits, deals with the complexities of those investigations and how some of it all played out. And those that are interested to read the book most certainly can get a copy and find out all of those particular details. With the 2 minutes or so that I have left, and I wanted to squeeze in a lot more, David, but I want to understand, for the longest time, the PAGAD leadership, in at least the more later years of the organization, they've claimed that there were efforts to sabotage their work. They often claim that, there were intelligence organizations that have infiltrated, which you have now, of course, confirmed, that were seeking to disrupt the organization and frame the organization for some of the work which it did not sanction. That some of the bombings and so on were either done by errant members or were done by third force, efforts to try and destabilize the organization. How do you respond to that?
I think it has the same credibility as the claim by former securocrats, the provincial government, the National Party government in the province, that PAGAD was an initiative, a project by the ANC to destabilize the provincial government. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming. You know, it's easy to make up a conspiracy theory because you simply declare it. You say, look, this was a thing to infiltrate PAGAD and to discredit the organization. Any sensible person who looks at the facts, just, I mean, read the newspapers, forget about a guy called David Africa who wrote a book. Listen to speeches made by PAGAD leaders. Look at the marches to the extent that you can get video. Read the speeches if you are able to get these in newspapers and so on. There is quite clearly an escalation, unless you are telling me that the most senior leaders of PAGAD and the G-Force, Abdusalam, Salih Abad, Butayu, and others, were all agents of the intelligence. If you say that, then I can agree with your thesis. But otherwise, it's not credible. I mean, the evidence is too weighty to come to that kind of alternative reality, as we would say in contemporary terms.
And so, what then do you think was their goal? Your earlier characterization of suggesting PAGAD, Islamic Unity Convention, Qibla, all think alike. They have similar ideology. You talk about the confluence of leadership between those organizations and the sort of brand of politics that they followed. You gave the characterization of not being accepted by majority Sunni Muslims, possibly aligned with certain countries, etc. The description of whether or not they were political in ideology, wanting to overthrow the democratic state or not agree with the way in which all of that happened. What do you think was the goal here? I think you kind of mentioned it a bit earlier when you talk about them wanting to establish an Islamic state. Do you think now, looking back at everything, that is still the case?
I think, well, when you asked whether that is still the case, I assume you're asking whether that is still my judgment or whether they still now want to establish an
Yeah, whether
Islamic
that is
state.
still your judgment.
That is my judgment. If you look at, you know, when you are judging a thing, and hindsight is our friend here, and you look at the trajectory of something, how it started and how it evolves, right? How it evolves both in speech and action. And these two things, when it comes to PAGAD, they dovetail each other very closely. Um, that remains my judgment that PAGAD was an initiative by Qibla to undermine the new democratic government, which Qibla had given no legitimacy to. Now, obviously, Qibla was entitled to hold that political view, but it was not allowed to use violence, or its members were not allowed to use violence in order to materialize that political view that they held. That is my view. Now, having said that, obviously, not everyone who joined PAGAD, in fact, the overwhelming majority of people who joined PAGAD, especially initially, were part of a project to undermine or overthrow the government. And people are frustrated about gangsterism and drugs, so they
Hmm.
join a movement that declares itself to be like that. Even some of the people who were involved in the G-Force who carried out attacks and killed people didn't do it for ideological reasons. They did it, in a sense, for the narrow purposes of being engaged in an anti-gangsterism, anti-drug activity. But the people who led both the G-Force and PAGAD were people who were committed to this political agenda. And
Okay,
and therefore
and and
I
and on
take my
that
position.
score, David, would you say that given the complex nature of the praxis of intelligence services, then and maybe even now. I mean, on the converse of things, one could argue what are very well documented evidence of how intelligence officers, for instance, got ingratiated with underworld figures that were pushing drugs and illicit goods into the market, was involved in
Mm,
nightclub security. We can go back quite far until today. Some of them are still there. Some have
mm,
died, some been assassinated, some are in prison, some continue to run things. And we're talking here even about, you know, cross-border operations and those from other nationalities, etc. How intelligence officers were quite key in that underworld scenario. Taking that into consideration, take into consideration the, I suppose, judgment about how right or wrong, based on the law, the interpretation of the law, the killing of certain individuals had been, that was seen as integral to this cancer on our communities of drugs and gangsterism. Do you think your approach worked? Um, to go after those that even at a superficial level claim to have been interested to try and respond to that crisis, that one could argue that the crisis has gone a lot worse. We are losing, almost an entire generation of young people to drugs and gangsterism. So is the efforts to infiltrate and disrupt, has that proven to be the most effective strategy?
okay, so the first assumption in your statement is that PAGAD was effective at nullifying gangsterism and drugs. Now, obviously, some people might feel good, about themselves by having killed a gangster or a drug dealer. In that sense, I suppose it's beneficial to those people. Gangsterism and drugs in the Western Cape, especially, is such. I mean, I know because we grew up here. Is such a complex dynamic that to think that you are going to kill a certain number of people and then there's going to be no gangsterism and drugs is quite foolish. That's apart from the fact that what you are doing is illegal in terms of just the law,
Yeah,
right? I'm talking about impact. Now, we were obviously impactful in neutralizing PAGAD's paramilitary capability. I mean, we were never interested in neutralizing PAGAD's ability to mobilize communities against gangsters and drugs and so on. Where there was a huge failure was that having neutralized PAGAD, we did not use the skills we developed, the intelligence approaches we developed, the institutions we were building, because as we were dealing with PAGAD, for example, there was the Prevention of Organized Crime Act that came into being because the president at the time, especially in Mbeki, was very committed to dealing with organized crime. And for example, which is why he established first IDOC, the Investigating Directorate on Organized Crime, and then the Scorpions.
yeah,
Many of those things were rolled back subsequently
sure.
through corruption, through the collusion of what you mentioned, intelligence and police officers in organized crime, and through also sheer incompetence. So I have no argument with the thesis that our ability to combat organized crime, gangsterism, the drug trade has been greatly diminished,
Yeah.
partially because we didn't learn from the Pagot experience. Um, that I'm in full agreement with you. I still don't think, because often people ask me if Pagot emerged again in the way that they did then now, would you have the same approach? I mean, my response is in some ways I would join Pagot because the state has failed in its basic responsibility, which is to provide safety and security to its citizens. I still don't think that using violence against gangsters solves the problem of gangsterism and drugs. I think it's a much larger problem that has to be addressed by a much
Yeah.
larger state and societal response, which includes the development of intelligence capabilities that's targeting organized crime, which
Okay.
we have not developed as a
Right.
state.
David, I've really pushed the limits. Yeah, I am out of time. There's so much more I wanted to ask you. About this very Yeah, as I say, it's quite the book. Of course, forwarded also by Kgalema Motlanthe, South Africa's former president, that says the defeat of Pagot stands out as one of the most dramatic intelligence achievements in a democratic era. Was Pagot defeated? I'll guess I'll leave you to answer that question.